The RPG genre in general has been extremely popular in the video game industry for a long time. Games like Elder Rings, The Witcher, and even the Dragon Quest franchise are extremely important for the video game industry. But one franchise in particular, it has been very important to me since I was a child. This franchise could only be Final Fantasy. Huge games like Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IX are very important games. Most people nowadays, people who played these games at the time of their release and were greatly impacted by them. This is still evident today. People revisiting these games, or even playing them for the first time indeed, have a significant engagement with these games, whether it's because of their story, their mechanics, or even their gameplay style. No game has impacted me as much throughout my life playing games as one specific spin-off of this franchise called Final Fantasy Tactics. With such a fun and engaging gameplay mechanics, even though it wasn't the first of its kind, it was the first one I played and the one that left the most impact on me. After watching several videos on YouTube, I discovered that many people share the same feeling about this game. And even though it is an extremely niche style, it's a very good game. It is a game that has spanned many generations, a very old game that still has a significant impact today. Many tactical strategy games have been created since then, but none have managed to surpass or even come close to what Final Fantasy Tactics was. Even with an excellent story, when I played for the first time, I didn't understand the language of the game and couldn't follow the story that way. Thus, it was extremely engaging with all the animations, gameplay styles and mechanics. All of this gave a sense of immersion even if I couldn't understand the story exactly. Of course, playing it again when I was older and able to understand the story only made me enjoy the game even more with its extremely good story. And ever since I started creating games, I've dreamed of making a game that comes at least close to what Final Fantasy Tactics was for me. After spending some time learning about game creation, I was able to release my first game. That was Ninja Monkey, which some of you might already know from some videos here on the channel, and it's already available on Steam. It's a really fun game, but that follows a different direction in gaming. Now that I've had a good experience creating games, I decided to pursue this dream of making a game in the style of Final Fantasy Tactics, which for me is still the best game I've ever played. And to start, I could begin in another way, like creating the sprites to get an idea of what the game will be like. It turns out that this game was a bit difficult to start because I didn't know exactly where to begin. So after some time trying to create the sprites, I decided to see how it would work in the game so that I could do everything in the best possible way. And this might seem much easier than it really is, since working on a two-dimensional game, to create an environment with that three-dimensional impression, you need to simulate an entire extra dimension which may not be that complicated, but it ends up creating many bugs and issues with things you didn't consider when creating, because the number of possibilities in making a game is very large, and most of the time you can't simulate all the possibilities to know if it's working in the best way or not. And unlike a three-dimensional game, where that dimension already exists, in a two-dimensional game, you have to simulate all the collisions, the entire order in which the sprites will appear, to give the impression of 3D, allowing you to collide with walls effectively, either passing beneath or over them, depending on your character's height. That's why I created some very simple tile sets, just to get an idea of how it could be and to see the best way to create this false impression. But since this part is a bit tedious, with creating various codes and running several tests, I've brought here roughly how it turned out in the end. Of course, this improved as I continued testing, but after obtaining this result, I could already create better sprites, since the format of the sprites would work very well this way. So, it was time to run the tests, initially creating various sprites for the grass scenario, which is usually the most common setting in games of this style, to get a basic idea of how the environment sprites would look. I conducted various tests, replacing the old scene with the new ones. One way I used to simulate this false 3D was by making with the ground becoming progressively lighter as the height increases, as if simulating being closer to the camera camera and closer to the light. It also ends up being a way to identify the height of your character in relation to the ground, since depending on your position, this would become very difficult. Hard to notice. You wouldn't know if you are 1 meter, 2 meters or 10 meters high. After asking some people what they thought of the sprites and conducting several tests, I managed to create one that I was somewhat pleased with, and here is how it ended up working in the way I made it. The game already works almost like a map editor, and I could create everything in the best way with the pseudo 3D fully simulated, since he uses the sprites themselves to determine the character's height, the level they are at, and send the necessary information to manage collisions, the order of the sprites, and so on. I also created a small system where the character could climb small heights, which would be roughly this height, which is roughly halfway up the character's height in a completely smooth manner, as if climbing stairs, while for greater heights he could ascend with a jump. This jump happens automatically when you get close to these platforms. Of course, this jump would be limited, you couldn't jump to an infinite height, but this limitation, as in normal strategy games, is determined by an attribute. Yes, in Final Fantasy Tactics, this attribute is the jump, which gives you the power to navigate the vertical plane of the map more freely. But somewhat different from tactical games in general, I wanted you to have free movement on the screen before entering combat, since in combat for this type of game, the movement is all grid-based, using movement points. Since I was already working on character movement, I also created the entire grid movement system. This movement specifically uses tiles as grids. Each tile would be a little square within the grid, and you would navigate through them. This way, I would already have height information for each tile that would greatly facilitate movement creation. This grid-based movement would be used in battles, and after some tests, it wasn't very difficult to create since the foundation was already in place with the character's free movement. Something I did to simplify creation was generating the entire grid at the start of the battle, individually. Each little square of this grid would be created separately and would have the necessary information to use, such as the height information of that square, the position information of that square, if it is a square that would be affected if there was any enemy, and so on. It became much easier to create things this way and allowed me to disable all collisions, preventing bugs during this type of interaction, which is the combat interaction. In an action combat, usually everything is based on collisions when your attack collides with the enemy or the enemy's attack. It collides with you, the interaction happens, and you either take damage or deal damage, and so on. You can inflict negative effects, and this can vary greatly from game to game. But in action games, that's generally how they work. For tactical combat, I found it easier to have the tile itself contain these details. I have access to the character on the tile, and from there I can create all the interactions I need. This might seem minor, but it greatly simplified the creation process and allowed me to develop all the interactions between characters and enemies much faster within the combat system. One feature in newer tactical games that wasn't in Final Fantasy Tactics is also a way to speed up the game with different colors for the squares. In Final Fantasy Tactics, you had colors indicating where you could move and where you could attack, and it was all done separately. But in more recent games, this is all done to speed things up. When your character's turn begins, you know exactly how far you can attack, even if you're not at the location. This way, you can execute all the movement and attack in one go with a single click. Moreover, with different colors, you can see where it's safe to end your turn so that you cannot be attacked. I created two different types of range for this game, which is not usually how it works, as each spell typically has a specific range. But in this game, I created the range for weapons and the range for abilities, which are two different ranges used for different skills. Some abilities could indeed use the weapons range, but generally, you have those two ranges within this game. This way, I could also show where the enemies can attack and where they can use abilities, making it even easier for you to identify where it's safer for you. The idea of creating various styles with the information was one of the best ideas when I started to create, because everything began to flow much faster after that. It was much easier to create new weapons and new movements and add to the game. After creating the entire character scheme, it was very simple to apply that to the enemy and make it work normally. Having worked on path generation on a grid map in some previous projects, it was quite easy for me to create this. After some bugs, of course, that always happens. But being a new project that I'm starting just recently, I don't have much of it ready just yet. As you can see, all the characters have the same sprite, which is sort of a template sprite I made. All the classes, characters and so on, I will create based on this template, so it will be much easier to just replace the sprites and add them to the game. Also taking advantage of how easy it is to create new weapons, I have already made some for testing, including ranged weapons like bows, weapons with medium range, weapons like spears, and close range weapons like daggers, staffs and swords. I'm making this game with a lot of care, even though I'm just starting now, as it's based on one of my favorite games. Actually, my favorite game. As is my favorite game, I've researched a lot about it and what makes this game so good. Well, many people have different opinions, but one thing I've noticed from all of this is that it is a game loved by many people, even though it's a very niche game. What made me very happy and gave me more motivation to create this game. I don't know if in the end this is the kind of game people want and if it will be very successful. I even believe it might not be, as it is indeed a very niche genre, but it's a game that for me as a game developer I've always wanted to make, and I think this is a good time to start since I already have some experience in this area. And for those who are just joining and want to check out some of my games, I'll leave a link here for Ninja Monkey, which is on Steam, and a link to Kid Jack, a game I made a long time ago when I was learning, but it is an award-winning game on the platform it is on, and it's actually quite a good game, even though I made it a long time ago. And of course I made it while I was learning, so it's not a game with all the abilities I have nowadays. But if you could help me by commenting on the game, what you think about this style of game, what you think about tactical RPG games, and if you could recommend some tactical RPG games so I can play and see how all the mechanics work. And of course, leave comments if you have any ideas, even to say if you like this type of game or not. So that's it. I hope to be able to show more and more of the progress of this game. Now that I've started working on it, I plan to post a lot more about it here. As soon as I have new things, I'll be posting more, but I intend to do so weekly. It's also a way to motivate myself to keep creating. So I hope you like it and comment on what you think of all this. It would be great for me, and if you could check out my games, I'd be very happy. So that's it. If you can subscribe to the channel as well, comment on everything, it's very good, and goodbye.